All right, welcome to Macro Micro Moment with my partner at Arthur B. Laffer Jr. You have to say the B.
You do. If you say Junior, you got to say the B.
It's important to him, and it stands for bets. So that's also important.
All bets are off. But mine's with a Z.
Z. We've got a lot to
That's
talk
Z.
about. All right, we're
You
done talking about you. We have a lot to talk about today, which is it's going to take us around the globe in 1 minute. But first and foremost, we just want to thank you all for joining us. We've been getting a lot of feedback. It's been great. If you have any questions, you can submit them on X, I think. Yeah. And join the chat because we'd love it. We're kind of tired of talking to each other. It's like the 5th time I've talked to Arthur today. But anyway, let's go around the world with Arthur B. Laffer Jr.
And we're back from outer space. So today we're going to talk a little bit about China, big country. So I think that if you've been watching any of the headlines in the U.S., you're talking about Trump's 100-day speech in I think it was Michigan or Wisconsin, Michigan, right? Michigan. And there's all this stuff about tariffs, but I thought I'd do is I'd jump over and not talk about Canada this time, but talk about China. And it's going to tie into our conversation a little bit later about the U.S. earnings, how things are going here. And the reason I think it's important is Nancy and I have been talking about inflation, the tariffs, how the tariffs work their way through the economy. And most people really care about how it works its way through our economy. But it's also important to know how it works its way through the global economies. And our biggest trading partner, or one of our biggest trading partners, is China. And some of the numbers that came out.
Before you move on, could you just share with everyone, because we talked about the Canadian election, can you just, for those who don't watch the news as much as we do, could you just tell them what happened?
So it was a close election. It's actually interesting. So the Conservatives, who had been favored by 20 plus points, while Justin Trudeau was still prime minister, and over the last year or so, they picked a new prime minister candidate, Mark Carney, who was former head of the Bank of Canada, and then actually went over and ran the Bank of England. Came back, they propped him up, they put him in place of Justin Trudeau, who stepped down, and under the Liberals, under the Liberal government, and he just won the election, not by a huge margin, but when you look at the turnaround in polling and the actual final numbers, the Liberals pulled the rabbit out of the hat, literally pulled the rabbit out of the hat. I think the Conservatives are going to be licking their wounds and wondering what happened to them. Blame it on Trump. Why not? I mean, that or maybe Elon Musk. But I think really what it was is Carney comes across as much more of an adult. Trudeau had a lot of baggage. He had a lot of ill will, and he had a lot of scandals in his administration. And that was really, really hurting the Liberal Party. They did a full 180 and pulled off a win. And now we'll see what the policies are going forward to see how different Carney is going to run the government versus his predecessor, Justin Trudeau. So it should be very interesting.
Thank you.
But much more of an adult.
Okay.
Yeah. And then interesting. So we're gonna go over some numbers in the U.S., but I'm gonna throw out some numbers. I'm gonna have to read them off because I can't remember these things. So March Purchasing Managers Index in China was in 49. Anything below 15 below is a contraction. So you see Purchasing Managers Index is in contraction territory. March industrial production was up 7.7. So two numbers contrast quite a bit. Industrial production was up because guess what? They're trying to meet all the demand for the rest of the world to get in front of the tariffs. So industrial production was cranking out toys and all sorts of other stuff that everybody uses, especially the U.S. So that's year over year, up 7, almost 8%, led by strong export-led manufacturing. And it's been offsetting the weak domestic demand. So China, it's interesting, it's kind of two stories here. Continued bad local domestic economy. Really, it's the exporters that have been really helping bail out China's economy. It has not been doing well overall, led by this huge downturn in housing that they cannot seem to get it moved out of the system. So it's kind of
That
like
they caused. That
they
they
oh,
caused.
absolutely, they caused it.
Yeah.
So they caused it, and now they're doing all these horrible policy prescriptions, which are not fixing it. They're just basically masking the issue. And the exporters have really been bailing out the economy, which is why this trade issue is such a much bigger deal for China, I think, than almost any country on the planet that I can think of, because their domestic economy is still not in good shape. April new export orders index was at 44.7. Now I said 50 is break even, everything below 50 is contraction. So April new export orders index was at 44.7. That's big contraction.
Yeah.
That's actually the worst number since COVID. Retail sales were up 5.9% year over year, but the government has increased its stimulus. So cash for the clunkers. They did this 8-item major household items like microwaves, refrigerators, dishwashers, trying to stimulate domestic demand. They've been doing it by all these subsidies and stimulus. They just increased it from 8 items to 12 because, you know, if 8 doesn't work, you might as well do 12. And I'd say, hey, if you're gonna do 12, you should probably do 50. Throw money at the problem. That'll make everybody want to go borrow tons of money and invest in the economy. Just throw government money at it, right?
You know what my favorite policy is from this administration?
No.
Let the water flow from your shower head. But that was an executive order.
Really?
Yes. Which we could talk about executive orders for the rest of our lives, but yeah, good showers. And he talked about it last night. He was like, I want a good shower, no drip, drip, drip for my luscious hair.
No low flush toilets, no low water flow shower
That's,
heads. Actually, I'm 100% in favor of that too.
oh, I'm ecstatic.
I want a waterfall pouring out of my shower. Unemployment in China, which there's always this fear that they cook the numbers. I think that's pretty much a foregone conclusion that China manipulates their numbers. But unemployment number is 5.2, which is interesting. Is they discontinued the youth unemployment index and then rejiggered it, removing students and stuff in the number. But you're still talking at youth unemployment. These are people of ages 16 to 24. Is unemployment rate is 16.2%. So still very high. And then
GDP numbers, Arthur, growing at 5. Did you believe the GDP numbers for China?
No.
Growing at 5.4%.
No, and then the question is, do they adjust for the stimulus? There's all these little things. I mean, these are pretty complex calculations in the sense of the timing and all that other stuff. So, do I think they're overstating GDP? Yeah, they still have it running, I think 5.2% or something like that. It's probably a couple percent lower than that in real terms. And the real issue is that before this silly stimulus stuff, they were lowering rates, trying to make capital more available to try to prop up and create more transactions in the housing market. But the problem is if you're already underwater in housing, who's going to lend you money? You can't borrow. You're already underwater. And so it becomes self-fulfilling that, they make credit available to people that aren't able to borrow. So what do you do? And so the housing, which was more than a third of their entire economy, it was like 38% of their economy at least, was directly related to real estate. Real estate's collapsed. It hasn't come back. Maybe they should start like buying houses and destroying them. Like that, the broken window, like if you break a house, maybe that'll work, and it won't.
So most people listening would say, well, this has got to be good for America. But you were talking about this earlier today. What's your take on the implications for the U.S. of a weak China?
I mean, it makes them definitely from a national security standpoint, makes them much more dangerous. There's nothing like backing a country like China into an economic corner where they don't have the ability to get out of the way of all of their troubles. And the question is, what do they do? Xi is a dictator. He's a leader for life. He's removed all of the checks and balances on power, which means the only way that you can remove someone like this is, unfortunately, death, or someone has to come in bigger and stronger and usurp them. Just like Russia is the same thing now. In North Korea, dictatorships are very hard to to get out and remove the power because they don't, Xi doesn't want to give up power. That's why he's leader for life.
Yeah.
And the question is, what are they going to do if the economy? Because there's one thing that these guys actually have to worry about, and that's putting a lot of people out of work and having a disaffected populace, because that's how you get revolts. That is the threat to power.
So the great, I taught a course on C.S. Lewis at the college level, which was a blast. And one of his great quotes is how monotonously alike is every dictator. And it's true. I mean, do you remember when she escorted his predecessor out of I forget what it's called, for lack of a better word, Congress?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's crazy.
The guy was sitting
Uh,
there, and they came and grabbed him and said, "Out." And he
yeah.
looked, I think he saw his life flashing before his eyes.
Exactly. So bigger, stronger to your point. But I also think you'd said something to me earlier today about how this will have a negative impact on businesses in the US if the exports from China, or imports in our case, seize up. We've already seen it in container ships, and just falling off, and we're probably going to continue to see it in all aspects of the economy. So I don't know if you're prepared to talk about that, but it's certainly something we're going to watch.
Yeah, I mean, look at, I think I said it earlier, maybe I didn't, maybe said it in the earlier hour. This is kind of like a mini COVID environment. If we all remember what happened to COVID, we shut down the economy and you had these huge disruptions to the supply chain. That's happening to a lesser degree, but it's happening again.
Yeah.
You've seen now exports, new orders collapse in China. That's going to feed back into shipping, which means our ports aren't going to get a lot of ships, which means trucking is going to slow down. Diesel fuel demand should fall.
Right.
And this is, we've talked about in the last couple of programs, Nancy, is that, expect volatility, but also be cognizant of the fact that if you buy the right companies that know how to handle and adjust to changing business climate, as long as they're not right in the square in the crosshairs of, let's say, a protracted trade dispute, I think you can do really well. You can buy some really good companies, hopefully cheap.
Yeah. Sorry to interrupt. I was on CNBC yesterday, and there's a segment called Three Stock Lunch. And two of the names I talked about, one we're going to talk about later in the show, was Microsoft as a buy. Pretty tariff proof, because software is pretty tariff proof. Now, some of the equipment driven stuff is a different story, but also AbbVie, which is, pharmaceuticals and Botox. So also pretty tariff proof. So I think there are places to make money. We saw the market today down 800 points for the Dow at the low, and it rallied back to up 150 at the close. So there's a lot going on, most of which is traders, reading the headlines. We always talk about the algorithms reading the headlines in the morning. They sell off, hedge funds join in, and then, the cooler minds prevail. And that's what we saw today. Sometimes it takes days or weeks, but today turnaround, which is usually the mark of the end of volatility, or negative volatility. But anyway, so was there anything else you wanted to say about that?
Not about China.
Okay. Should we go to GDP?
I think we should go to GDP.
Okay. We got the print today. It was negative, not nearly as negative as expected. I'll explain the negative. You explain what's going to happen rest of year. So for those of us who don't live in an accounting world, what happens when in the calculation of GDP is that inventories are deducted from the gross domestic product. And so what we saw in the first quarter, and we've talked a lot about how tariffs distort behavior, and that's exactly what we saw. So imports to the US, retailers, individuals, everyone was trying to get ahead of the tariffs. And so we saw imports go up by, I think, about 50%. And that was a detraction from GDP. So what's going to happen next quarter, Arthur?
Yeah, so the import's a negative number. And then when it shows up on the inventory side, that's a positive number. So there's a timing issue that negatively impacted GDP, because this is all accounting. This is double entry accounting. So the import is the one side, the inventory is the other side. You're going to see the offset, which will probably make second quarter look better than we would expect it to look based on the actual real on the ground economic conditions. What's interesting, Nancy, is we talked about, the first quarter number being down 0.3%, but imports of durable goods were down 3.4%, which is interesting. The trade deficit in goods was $162 billion in March, just March. And imports were 342 billion. That's March. So goods were more than almost half the total amount of imports for the month of March, and they are hit records. These are record highs.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. And it's interesting because the business investment in equipment was up 22% versus last year. I think it was up 3% for the same period. So if anybody's unsure whether the consumer and businesses are trying to time the tariffs, they are, and they're
Front
doing it
loading.
in a bigly way.
Yeah.
It's
Yeah.
so
And so
kinky.
it could be fine. It could be fine in the long run, but it is a distortion. And I think that is something, and clearly the market figured that out today, but that is something that we have to be aware of. I saw the president after I saw the headlines after the cabinet meeting, and he was commenting on GDP, and he said, this is the terrible economy that President Biden left to us, and this is the stock market response. Because the market's now down since his election. That's Biden's stock market. I just wondered if you had any comments on that.
It's not Biden's stock market anymore. It's his. Absolutely. I mean, this is primarily trade related. The Doge stuff and the other things. Government spending was down in the first quarter by 5%.
Yeah.
So government spending's down, and everything we're talking about right now is almost exclusively related to the effects of major trade policy changes, and the economy's response to it. And it's not just our economy; it's China's, it's Europe's. Everybody's having to respond to it.
Right.
We're the 800-pound trade gorilla.
So Scott Bessent has said that he thinks this administration is analogous to the Reagan administration, kind of, slow out of the box. And I could make that argument, but since you're our in-house Reagan expert, as Arthur Betts Laffer Jr., maybe you could just give us your feedback on that before we go. Oh, we're almost done. Before we go to individual names.
Yeah, this is not a Reagan economy. Reagan economy had strong dollar, and trade's one of those things where it's not whether you have a deficit or a surplus. It's why you have a deficit or a surplus that really matters, much more so than whether you have one. And if you think about this, trade deficits, this is an accounting term, and a trade deficit for a country has an offsetting entry, and that's a capital surplus. And the question, I think, all things being equal, do you want capital lined up on your border trying to get in or out? Under Reagan, we had a strong dollar. And what we're doing is we were basically sucking in foreign capital because everybody wanted to come to the U.S. because it was a great place to invest. And when you took a factory from Japan and you moved it to the U.S., it went from a negative real return to a positive real return. It's no surprise that foreigners were trying to sell more goods to us because we were using their cheap products to grow the economy. Now,
and we're prosperous. We're a prosperous nation. So
absolutely,
I've heard your dad say that many times, that is going to result in a trade deficit. But the word deficit has a negative connotation, and so I think that's one of the things that many of us, most people who don't do what we do for a living, don't necessarily understand. So lastly, you and I were talking about tariffs, whether or not they're inflationary. And you reminded me that a tariff, that inflation is a monetary phenomenon, too much money chasing too few goods, right? And so there are a lot of economists that are saying tariffs are not inflationary, but a tariff is a tax. And so it creates a price shock.
Yep.
So I haven't finished my remodel, mostly have. And they've informed me that for the garage and some of the other small things I'm doing, everything's gone up 20%. That's a price shock. Now, whether or not that's inflation, because it only happens once, I still feel pretty bad about it. Yeah. And I think that's what we've seen reflected in the University of Michigan numbers, which have a 1 year, this is what we call soft data. So it's sentiment, and it's a 1 year forward inflation expectation that just recently hit 6.5%. We haven't seen that since 1981. You weren't alive in 81. I was. And I remember you were?
Of course I was. I'm almost 60 years old, Nancy. God.
Well, I was more alive than you were, and it was a gruesome time. So that number is something that I think we all need to pay attention to. Now, Secretary Bessent's response to that was, "I don't care how people feel, I just care that they're spending money." And if you look backwards, to your point, they are spending money, but it's only because they're front loading everything. Like I can't tell you how many people that I know that have said, "I'm going to run out and get an iPhone before the prices go up," and I just don't move that quickly, but I was going to go out and get a car. I may have missed the window. I want the Ford pricing, the employee pricing.
You
But
know what, Nancy, also, I want to delineate between a trade deficit and trade surplus and trade policy in general, like unfair trade with another country. And we use like, I'm going to pick on Japan, where they have clear non-tariff barrier trade to like American beef and autos. And all of these countries do. Europe charges much higher tariffs on US manufactured autos than we do. So what I want to do is make sure that unfair trade is bad, and we should always be trying to negotiate fair
right,
trade with all of our partners outside of strategic trade, where like we're talking like yellow cake uranium for bombs. Like that's a very different animal than like toaster ovens, right? But having fairer trade is important. If this administration, hopefully, what they do is they say broaden the tariff level and bring it way down so that it's much more even between the US and our trading partners. That would be a really good thing. That is
really
fair.
good.
That should be the way it works. It shouldn't be that we buy all their stuff because we don't hit it with a tariff and then they hit our stuff with a tariff. That's not fair.
Right. And we talked about this in our client call today, but in the manufacturing sector, which is a focus of this administration, we should point out that there are 482,000 manufacturing jobs that manufacturers have not been able to fill. But so bringing more jobs here, I don't know if that's really feasible because we've got a bunch of jobs we can't fill. But separately, 2/3 of manufacturing GDP is imported parts and services. And so if you're trying to make the manufacturing sector more robust, then you have to pay attention to that when you start laying out all these tariffs. And so what we've now started to see, and I think this is why the market has recovered, is that they're doing carve outs. So if you're building an auto, you can have this many parts from somewhere else, and I think the carve outs, they undermine the purpose, but or well, we're not really sure what the purpose is, but um, maybe it's just to isolate China, but they undermine some of the effort, but they create more certainty for corporate CEOs. And that's one of the numbers that has been concerning to me, is that we're seeing CapEx freeze up, we're seeing new orders for manufacturers freeze up, and it's because no one knows where we're going.
And think about the I think it was our last summit we talked about, automated robotics. That we had that little tile machine, and I watched one of those house printers where it prints, it extrudes all the concrete for the foundation. So
3D printing. Yeah.
if you're right about this shortage of labor, and it's going to get exacerbated by the trade issues.
Yeah.
Just one more reason, AI and tech and robotics and all these things that we keep talking about look consistently more and more attractive.
Yeah, no, you're 100% right. I was talking to one of our clients and they said, we're baby boomers and we're a fiercely independent generation. And I was thinking, I think it was the rock and roll, but that's for another time. And they, and they said, if they take our keys away, we're going to get in a Waymo or a self-driving Uber, and I hadn't thought about that. I've just focused on the robot that can fold my laundry and shake a martini, even though I don't drink martinis. But I think it's just interesting that there are going to be a lot of solutions, and traditional remedies that we had. Like, we took the battery out of my father-in-law's car because hiding the keys did, and then he was like, "Can you believe it? Someone came in the garage and took the battery out." We're like, "No." We just didn't want to argue with them, and that worked. But that's not going to be an issue. You can take the car away, but people are still going to be able to get around. Okay, so we're running over. I think we want to go to stocks to watch,
Yeah.
maybe. Okay. So our adorable producer asked me to show you my shoes I'm wearing today, but I'm too shy. They're amazing. So what I wanted to talk about real quick, because we are running long, but and I'm looking at my screen, so give me one sec. So we've continued to hear that the AI trade is over, that technology stocks are overvalued. Even with the sell-off, you get these folks who move in one direction. When things sell off, they move in another direction and they don't go back. What we were doing was adding to names like ServiceNow and Microsoft in the last 6 to 8 weeks. And what we've seen is that ServiceNow came in, and remember, they're a software company. So in the AI trade, we began shifting our exposure to software at the margin, even though we still own a lot of the infrastructure names like Broadcom and NVIDIA. But we're shifting to software, which again is a somewhat tariff proof. We didn't know that, but it's a byproduct. But as the adoption of AI becomes more and more broad-based, and we are seeing that across sectors from the companies that we look at, software is how you implement a lot of this. And so ServiceNow beat on earnings, beat on revenues, and raised guidance, and the stock was up over 10% as a result. Tonight, we got Microsoft, the cloud computing business, came in hotter than expected. There it is. They beat as Azure cloud business grew 33%. You've heard that it's decelerating. It is decelerating from 99% growth to 33, and it's been decelerating for, I don't know, 10 years, 8 years. But what I think is important is that in the after hours trading, stock's up 6%. And that's how you make money in investing, is you look at the high quality companies, and when they have a hiccup, you make sure that it's not a serious problem, and then you add to holdings, which is what we did with both ServiceNow and Microsoft. And then we heard from Texas Instruments, which is a chip company. We heard from them last week, and or earlier this week, it's all a blur, but they beat and they beat and they raised guidance. And that's important because they're an old economy chip maker that is somewhat tariff proof because nobody cares about the chips they make. So they're not being limited by the US government. And their base of users is super broad based. So it's industrial, autos, Internet of Things, electronics. So we're seeing these companies deliver good earnings, which are backward looking, but more importantly, they're delivering strong guidance. And then we also got Meta tonight, which is also up 6%, driven by advertising. We expected that. We don't own it. We bought Spotify instead, and that's been a much better place to be. But when we sold Meta, but we own Google, and we saw their earnings last week, and they delivered a very robust report, which popped the stock up, and they doubled down and recommitted to their CapEx budget. And I think that is important to note. The AI trade is not over. We're in the early innings of a bull market, or the early years, maybe not early innings, but early years of bull market. Average bull market 5 years, 178%. We're at 2.5 years and around 50%. So I think there's plenty of room once we get through this volatility, all contingent on these tariffs and the policy not driving us into a recession, which I think both of us agree we won't hit. If we were to go into a recession, it would be very mild. I think we're more in a decelerating economy, which is another reason why you want to own these stocks, because they produce reliable earnings growth. And when earnings is scarce, you want to own the reliable earnings growers. They've got robust fortress balance sheets, and they're raising the dividend. So, yeah.
I think, I don't know if you saw this, Nancy, speaking of Waymo, that they might be selling direct to the consumer. Do you hear that?
They are.
Oh, I didn't know they are. Okay.
All the young people in the office use them to go everywhere.
That's right. You're in Scottsdale and Phoenix, right? They're all over the place.
Yeah.
And I guess they've also talked about cutting a deal with Toyota.
Yep. So it's here. FSD for Tesla is happening. They're starting in Austin, and I think they've already started in China. And then everybody asks about Uber. Uber will probably end up being the platform. And then don't forget about Uber Eats. So, it freaked me out at first when I saw the Waymos because and now you can't go to an intersection without there being 4 or 5. I think I was talking to you on the phone one time, and I'm like, oh my God,
Yeah.
there's 9 at this intersection, and they are everywhere, and they often have passengers in them now. So it's a new brave new world, folks, and we're going to invest alongside of it. That's all I have.
I haven't got anything else either.
Okay, well, I'm Nancy C. Tengler.
I'm Arthur B. Laffer Jr. And this is
I'm
Micro
senior.
Micro Moment.
All right. We'll see you next week. Thank you.
Thanks everybody. Take care.